Welcome to the Kriya Yoga podcast, a source of inspiration and actionable education for those inspired towards the goal of enlightenment through yogic meditation. Through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share the possibility of waking up to the reality of self and God realization, and to remind you of the immortal words of Paramahansa Yogananda. Don't look back. Don't look to the left or to the right. Look straight ahead to the goal and go all the way in this lifetime. I'm Ryan Kurczak, and I'll be your host on this adventure of spiritual self-discovery. Good morning, everybody, and happy July. We've reached that time of year when the sun is as close to the North Pole as possible, and we know that the body is a representation of the earth, and the sun is a representation of infinite spirit, the light of infinite consciousness. And so when we reach this time of year around the northern solstice, this spiritual energy, this spiritual light is more enlivening of the sixth chakra and the higher chakras. This makes it a great time to engage in the more lofty aspect of our spiritual practice, utilizing that energy of the sixth chakra, that energy of discernment, and tapping into our capacity for higher knowledge. And so in this podcast, we're going to explore some more abstract principles as they relate to yoga and spiritual growth. We're going to consider the role and the reality of those primordial forces of creation known as the Gunas. And this month on the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community, I've begun a class series specifically on the Gunas, and that's going to run for several months. Members of the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community, they're sent a lesson on the first of each month. And so for the next maybe 6 to 8 months, the focus of those lessons are going to be exploring the role of the Gunas in yoga practice. And my goal is to take this material and turn it into an evergreen course that I can offer to students. So participants on Patreon, in a way, are going to help me develop this course. I'm going to present the material as I understand it from my own study and from my own contemplation, but ideally, I'd like to see students listen, pay attention, study the material as it's delivered, and then submit their questions for clarification so that as the course progresses, I'm able to speak to those questions and help clarify the material. Particularly when talking about things like primordial forces, which are beyond creation as we know it, and also usually beyond the reach of our human thought capacity. It's good to be as clear and thorough as possible in the teaching process. And the only way I know how to be as thorough as possible is to present the information, to listen to the feedback, to the questions that come, and then sculpt the class to the need of the participants and the need of the students. So this podcast, we're going to start to look into the Gunas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, and these primordial forces of nature. But if you do want to go into a greater depth of study with me, I'd like to encourage you to join the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community, or you can simply wait until we've completed the course, and then I'll offer it on Teachable. So kriya-yoga.teachable.com. We have several courses available there that you can take online, and one free course, which is also the result of this process, which is a course on Roy Eugene Davis's book, Absolute Knowledge That Liberates Consciousness. So in the meantime, while you're waiting, if you want to look into that, again, go to kriya-yoga.teachable.com. And when you look at the courses that are available, there's a free downloadable course called Absolute Knowledge That Liberates Consciousness. And in that course, we go through the material that Mr. Davis found important for your spiritual path. It's a wonderful read and well worth exploring. So without any further delay, let's consider what the Gunas are. What are these primordial aspects, these forces, these powers, these energies of creation? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. These are the names for these primordial forces of creation. Sattva is said to be the capacity for light and illumination, lightness and clarity. Rajas is said to be the energy, the quality of change. It's also that which directs us to feel like an individual. It creates a sense of separation. And Tamas is heaviness, ignorance, inertia. Through Tamas, we experience the world of form. And it's because of the interplay of these abstract forces that we're able to have experiences in this world. Now, as you can imagine, trying to take these ideas of these primordial, divine, infinite powers and to describe them in a few short words, or even to describe them at all, is impossible. But we're going to do our best. And we have to remember that as we talk about these powers, that they are abstract and that they are aspects of creation which are pre-mind, pre-human awareness. And they are infinite, eternal, and vast, which means that our limited human intellect can't really grasp them. However, it's the purpose of yoga to gain a direct experience and understanding of them. And this is important. It's because of the gunas that we are either bound to our experience of pleasure and pain and suffering and joy, the world of samsara. But it's also because of the gunas that we can become enlightened, that we can become spiritually free. Now, of course, we're simplifying things. The gunas aren't the actual cause themselves, but as we gain an understanding and appreciation, a feeling, a direct experience of the gunas, then what we can do through our life and through our yoga practice is ride Sattva guna to such a state of clarity that we can realize spiritual truths. We can know what we are as an eternal, immortal spiritual being. And then we can relate to the world. We can relate to the ever-changing flux of creation. Again, pleasure and pain, heat and cold, joy and sorrow. We can relate to that if we choose to, with wisdom and understanding. And this is one of the primary reasons to gain a sense of the gunas, to feel the gunas, to know what the gunas are, for the purpose of self-realization and God-realization. Now, within the course that I discussed that we'll be offering through the Kriya Yoga Online Patreon community, we're going to spend a lot of time going into the specifics of the gunas, how they relate to your activities, to your thoughts, to your emotions, to your psychological states, to the foods you eat, to the people you spend time with. But in this little introduction, my goal essentially is to introduce you to a way of working with the gunas, of becoming aware of the gunas. Now, the gunas, as these primordial cosmic powers, they are the underlying matrix of all material, mental, emotional, and psychological experience. So, as I mentioned, they can't be contained in any meaningful way through a short list of descriptive words. However, we can begin to notice them in our experience. And that's because the underlying influence of the gunas within our lives, they help us determine and see the nature and behavior of all things in the universe. And again, this is from inanimate objects to living beings to even states of consciousness. And so the balance of the gunas within our own state of consciousness determines essentially what our life will be like. For example, if there's a dominance of sattva, we're going to tend to experience more peace, more wisdom, and a capacity for spiritual growth. When rajas is more dominant, we tend to be driven by ambition, activity, and restlessness. When tamas is dominant, life is characterized usually by ignorance, lethargy, suffering, and a person is confused. When Tamas is dominant, that's when you have people who are going through situations and difficulties, and their response to that is always, I have no idea how I got here. I'm so confused. I don't know how to change. And when we let Tamas predominate, that experience perpetuates itself. So that's when you see individuals who go through life, and that is their recurrent reality. Now, the good news is we can shift our focus. We can shift our field of being from Tamas to Rajas to Sattva. And we can also learn to work with the Gunas, because there are times when Rajas is appropriate, when we need to have a little more ambition or drive. And there's times when Tamas is appropriate, where we need to rest or let things be or let inertia carry things forward. But for that to happen in a way that is helpful and uplifting, most of the time our life needs to be dominated by Sattva. Sattva needs to be in the lead role there. And then with the awareness of Sattva, we can tap into Rajas when needed, or we can tap into Tamas when needed. And so yoga practice, and really any authentic spiritual practice, is aiming to cultivate more Sattva. Aiming to cultivate more Sattva, and to diminish the influence of Rajas and Tamas, or at least to diminish the unconscious influence of Rajas and Tamas in one's life. And I find the exploration of the Gunas really interesting, mainly because when people become involved in spiritual paths or wisdom traditions, what normally happens? Well, they come upon a tradition and a discipline that says, you need to do these things to wake up or be clear or to have wisdom. And most people interpret those things as dogmas or moral imperatives. And when you see it that way, even though you know it's good for you, there tends to be some resistance there. And the beautiful thing about gaining insights and understanding in regards to the Gunas is that you see that what's required of you, spiritually speaking, within your wisdom traditions or your spiritual path, that these things are required not because they're a moral imperative forced upon you by the patriarchy, but simply because within the universe there are patterns, and if you tap into those patterns, you tend to experience more lightness, more buoyancy, more inner freedom. And when you tap into other patterns, you tend to become duller, more inert, develop more ignorance, more aggression, more difficulty within your life. And so when you think about the Gunas and cultivating Sattva and minimizing Rajas and Tamas, you can use your creative imagination and consider these three powers as though they're just currents of energy. And so when you live ethically, when you have compassion for others, when you practice truthfulness, there's an energy to that. And that energy creates more light, more awareness, more buoyancy within your life experience. And the more that you bring that into your awareness, the easier it is for you to live from a place of spiritual wisdom and understanding. When you do things that promote selfishness, aggression, tribalism, and small-mindedness, well, you're creating more problems for yourself and others. You're tapping into a more rajasic and more tamasic mindset. You're tapping into a current which is more restless, leads to more suffering, is more frustrating ultimately. And because of this, the Gunas can be a source of either our deepest suffering or the key to inner freedom and spiritual awakening. When we are identified with Rajas and Tamas, we are identified with constant change. Rajas promotes change. Tamas promotes unconsciousness, and this is suffering. Why? Because when we're in a world of constant change, there's no pleasure without pain, and there's no gain without loss, and so no joy without sorrow. And when we're unconscious, there's no wisdom or understanding. And you know that when you've been in a situation and you really had no idea why you're suffering or how this could happen or why this is so, This could be a personal situation. This could be you just observing the state of the world. When you're in that state of unknowing, well, there's a deep fear there because you don't know what's coming next. And you know that when you or others act from that place of fear and confusion, it just tends to make things worse. And often we can feel like any action that we're going to take is really just a gamble. And we don't know if our intentions or activities are ever going to result in peace or stability, but we're always hoping that they will, but we're doing it blindly. We're just taking action. We're flailing in this direction or reacting in that direction. We're hoping that peace and stability is going to come from it. And that is a very rajasic and tamasic approach to things. And sattva is very different. And in order to cultivate sattva, this is why spiritual traditions promote discipline. Think of someone you know that is very wise and calm and centered, and you've watched them, and when something happens, they don't immediately react to it. They observe, they look around, they might turn within and try to access their intuition. And you can think that that is just a God-given talent that they have, but more than likely, whether in this lifetime or their theoretical past lifetimes, they've cultivated that ability to be still, to be present, and to avoid overreactions. And when you see their lives, sure, things are going to happen to them that happen to all of us, but when you see their lives, it's as though you can see a purpose, a plan, and a consistent direction in their life. And that's because they're living from a place of sattva. They've learned to behave in such a way, to think in such a way, to feel in such a way that sattva is cultivated, and so they gain light and clarity. When sattva predominates, one tends to live with knowledge, grace, wisdom, and purpose. And that's because by choosing to pay attention to sattva guna, one's life becomes imbued with illumination. When a person's life is dominated by rajas and tamas, there's typically a feeling of floating adrift on unfamiliar seas, in the dark, and there are no stars to navigate. And usually people only by chance come upon an inhabited island, or they crash upon the breakers. But as you turn your attention to sattva, these clouds disperse and stars come out, and so you can see, you know how to navigate. The sea itself can become radiant and alive, and our experience of creation becomes illuminated, and it can guide us back to inner peace and spiritual well-being. Now remember, as we're talking about the gunas, we can really only do so in metaphor. And so when we consider this idea of sattva being illuminating or illuminating creation, of course, physical light is illuminating to physical things, but internally, light is awareness and inner guidance. And when your experience of life is illuminated, it doesn't mean that your life glows like a candle flame. What it means is you're able to be present and aware. You see possibilities and opportunities clearly. On the other hand, when tamas is dominant, well, that's a sense of ignorance, which is darkness, which is confusion, and an inability to see clearly. And so when decisions are made from that perspective, if they're made at all, usually it's because of whims or unconscious reverie. This is tamas's effect on the mind. When striving and craving are the most important things, when that's dominating our awareness, that's rajas. And then decisions tend to be made for selfish reasons or out of fear. So tamas experiences are made blindly. In rajas, decisions are made with tunnel vision. In the experience of sattva, decisions are made with a sense of connection to the wholeness of life. And you can begin to see this in your own life and in the lives of others that you know. Just consider your life. When it's time to make a decision or when things happen, do you feel purposeful about it? Do you feel clear? When difficulties arise, do you have a sense that, yes, this is a difficulty, that this can happen to anyone because we are embodied in this physical world which has a polarity to it, but are you able to feel like, but I can handle that because I'm connected to the greater whole. I'm connected to something. I'm part of something much bigger than myself, and I participate with that. Well, that's a sattvic approach. Do you tend to be restless about how you engage the world? If we think about maybe investing, The sattvic person finds an advisor who has wisdom and says, tell me what to do, and then they get gains from that. From a rajasic person, they think, well, let's invest, and to them that means let's just get on the internet and get some general opinions and follow that advice. It may work out, but anyone can say anything they want on the internet. And from a tamasic perspective, when it comes to investing, you might get a couple $1,000s and say, well, I'm going to go gambling, because you think that's a good idea. So consider how you might make decisions from a rajasic perspective. When it comes to making a decision, or when it comes to the quality of your life, is it usually made out of restlessness and whims? You don't really feel like you've got the information that you need. You're just kind of hoping it's going to work out. Or you feel very small and you feel like you need to get ahead of everybody else. Well, that's a rajasic motivation. Or you do things out of fear. Again, the tamasic motivation, usually there's not a whole lot of thought about it. You're not super motivated. You're just kind of there waiting to see what happens, and not in a place of wisdom and divine surrender. Imagine it like a rock. A rock can't do a whole lot. So if it rains, it's just got to endure it. If it's got to roll down the hill, that's just what's going to happen. There's no activity, nor is there really a whole lot of wisdom there. And of course, you might know plenty of people that have beautiful lives and that's how they live. But that's a whole other topic of karma and how karma manifests. What we're talking about is not your karma. We're talking about the way that you are interacting with your karma, the way you're interacting with the world. Now, the trouble with this is usually we have patterns, which means what I just described to you, you might not be able to imagine another way. You might not be able to imagine living from a sattvic perspective. That might seem absolutely foreign to you, to have intuition and inner guidance and wisdom. Similarly, if your life tends to be inspired, you might not be able to comprehend what it's like to gamble something away because it's never entered your mind. So we have to remember from another perspective that really individually we are the creation of the habits of the Gunas that our individual Purusha, our individual soul has entertained. Now, to a tamasic person, that's going to feel really bad because you're going to say, well, I've got all these habits I can't change anyway. And you're going to get fed up and you're going to quit and your faith is going to diminish even more. You'll have more doubt because you'll say, well, who am I to make a change? Who am I to believe I can have wisdom and clarity within my life? To a rajasic person, they're going to say, oh, all right, well, now I know what to do and I am going to make the change. I am going to take action to make it happen. And if Rajas is working well, that'll be very good for you. But what most people do, they have this type A psychological complex where now they get going and they never know when to stop. So you might notice that that's happened to you in your meditation or spiritual path where you just feel like you have to keep pushing, learning something new, learning something more. Rajas is involved. But here's the beautiful thing. Even if you're caught up in Rajas or Tamas, that's the past. You might have momentum coming forward, which is carrying these experiences into your life now in the present. But every action, every time you choose a behavior, a thought, a support that promotes sattva, you are increasing the momentum of sattva. And again, the beautiful thing is, from this point forward, the more you try to do that, the more sattva will accumulate. And as time goes on, you will feel less tamasic and less rajasic, and sattva will become more of a natural experience for you because you are changing the pattern of your chitta. And chitta is a term that many people interpret as mind, but I think it makes more sense to call it the field of consciousness, the field of your awareness. And again, in the course, we're going to go in a much more detailed fashion into the origination of the Gunas and how they move through creation, even down to the elements. And we'll discuss things like Chitta and Purusha and Prakriti and so on. But ultimately, my goal with this discussion is to help you approach the process with knowledge so that sattva can be experienced directly. And when that happens, the dogma that we see in religions and spiritual practices, we think it's dogma, and oftentimes it is, but the underlying reason that spiritual practices promote certain things, harmlessness, truthfulness, contentment, non-stealing, compassion, goodwill to others, it's essentially so that you can turn on the light of creation and see reality clearly and directly. It's as if when you engage sattvic activities, the darkness and cravings of the world fall away. And it's like a curtain being opened to let the light of the sun in. And then we see that we've been attached to and addicted to experiences of rajas and tamas, which essentially were nothing more than shadows on the wall. And one of the reasons that there is a lot of dogma in spiritual traditions and religion is because we're not too far out of the Dark Ages, the Kali Yuga, and that was from 700 BC to 1700 CE. And during the Kali Yuga, which is the material age of creation, the age of darkness, human consciousness can't really understand anything subtle or profound. And so for all religions, all spiritual paths, they're going to be dominated by religious laws and customs. And that's because religious laws and customs are the only way to preserve perennial wisdom within mass consciousness. Now again, fortunately, we're at the dawn of the Dwapara Yuga, the electric age, and that's more suitable to understanding the inner dynamics of consciousness. But we're just getting started. We're just getting into this new realm of understanding. And so there's still going to be leftover inertia from the past dark age. But we can learn to overcome that superstition. Through our spiritual practice, we can learn to overcome these dogmas. And so it's my wish to share this reality of the Gunas as a living, breathing, dynamic nature of creation, not as something to be the fuel for another dogma. Because essentially these authentic spiritual traditions, they are based upon metaphysical knowledge that the universe is pervaded by these primordial powers, the Gunas. And again, every action, thought, or object, they contain different ratios of these powers. And so certain actions, certain thoughts, certain objects, certain behaviors will promote one or the other of these Gunas. And when you look at your spiritual tradition, your authentic spiritual tradition, the recommendations that are given are solely for the promotion of sattva, light, clarity, and wisdom. And so if you are firmly interested in transcendence and enlightenment, you really have to infuse your surroundings, your activities, and how you nourish yourself with as much sattva as possible. And from the perspective of the yogic tradition, we have a very clear guidebook on how that's done. So what I would say is, rather than worry about how much rajas or tamas you have in your life, I would say to take your attention and put it towards sattvic things. Ramana Maharshi was once asked, what's the greatest support to our spiritual path, to our spiritual practice? And he said, sattvic diet. Now, it's likely he meant sattvic foods, fresh, nourishing fruits and vegetables. Any food which is easily digestible and promotes the health of the body, which promotes clarity of mind. This is a sattvic diet. But if we take the idea of food as nourishment, we can expand upon that. Anything that we do which brings this sense of aliveness, clarity, and peace into our life is sattvic nourishment. And when you read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is based upon Sankhya philosophy, which is how we know about the terms of the Gunas and so on, Patanjali speaks about cultivating samadhi, clarity of awareness, ekagrata, one-pointedness. And as we touch that state, that space, as we experience that possibility, every time we come into the realm of samadhi, of one-pointedness, of clarity, something happens within our consciousness. We become clearer. We lose our attachment to the afflictions, the kleshas. And when we do that enough, it's almost like it's cleaning us up inside. People say that it's burning away karma. however you want to look at it, there's a process going on which is removing, in a way, impurities. Impurities of what? Things that prevent you from seeing reality in yourself spiritually and clearly. So Patanjali talks about this a lot. And that's a very high form of yoga practice, one that is accessible to all of us. As long as we're a human being, we do have a capacity to access that. But before you can really, truly access these advanced stages of yoga, you have to look to the earlier stages of yoga, the yamas and niyamas. The yamas and niyamas are those parts of the path which, when you start to shape your consciousness around them, you cultivate more sattva. They're called the Great Vow in the Yoga Sutras. And so to actually be a yogi, to say, I am a yogi, those have to be your vow. And of course, you're not always going to do them perfectly, but you're trying. Just like when you're in a relationship, you're going to mess things up. You're not always going to see eye to eye. As long as you're not being malicious or trying to sabotage the relationship, you can still have a relationship and work through those difficulties. The same thing is true with the vow of your yoga practice. When you take the yamas and niyamas seriously and you try to find a way to make them real for you, alive for you, dynamic, something so important that you don't feel them as a moral dogma or a moral imperative, it feels important to you to keep as a vow. You are cultivating sattva. Learning to sit still, the practice of asana. We're not talking about flowing practices. We're talking about asana in the sense of being still. Sattva is related to stillness. And so as we learn to take care of our bodies and our minds so that we can sit still, to be still, we are opening the space for greater sattva. Pranayama is a wonderful practice because when you breathe, when you circulate the prana, the life force through the body, if there are any kind of emotional, physical, mental, energetic tensions which prevent you from being still or prevent you from appreciating the reality of the yamas and niyamas, it's pranayama which helps to throw all that stuff off, to throw out the impurities in a way. And once this occurs, then you can look within, then you can practice pratyahara. But in order to look within in a way that is authentic, which is not going to be colored by fantasy or more rajas, you have to have sattva developed first. Because what happens if you start to look within and you haven't really gained mastery over tamas and rajas, or you haven't learned to lead tamas and rajas from the perspective of sattva? Well, that's when you start getting people who say they're having kundalini disorders. Or that's when you start meeting people who have these really interesting visions, which are really good for YouTube fame and YouTube stories, but are not actually spiritually transformational. So it is the cultivation of sattva which allows the higher practices of yoga to be truly spiritually transformational, which is in a way a higher form of rajas, because rajas is transformation. But it is a transformation that leads you into expansiveness, into wholeness, into the capacity for one-pointedness and discrimination, which is a sattvic quality. And that sattva can become so strong that you can stay there. One of the books I wrote a long time ago, what was it? A Course in Tranquility. Well, in that book I talked about how to a yogi, being scattered and fragmented and full of doubt, that's hard to do. It's as hard to do that as it is for someone who's never tried to practice yoga, for them to be clear and awake. So if you're in a place where you can't imagine what it's like to be clear, inspired, living with purpose and a sense of connection to the wholeness, if you can't imagine that at all, or if you know people who are like that, well, that's impossible for a yogi. They can try and they can maybe think about it a little bit, but they are so established in clarity that seems very foreign. So by the cultivation of sattva, we are moving closer to source. We are moving closer to the realization of what we are as an immortal spiritual being. And before we conclude today, one of the things I'm going to talk about in the first lesson, which has already been released on Patreon, is how to gain a sense of the gunas within your meditation practice. And what I'm about to discuss, remember that this is not to make you feel bad about yourself or to create more judgments and difficulties. This is just a way of taking a step back and seeing, well, what is my meditation practice really like? Because it's very important to develop sattva to be able to take a very honest self-inventory. And so anytime that you can be very honest with yourself about where you are and maybe what you need to do to change, even if you're not being successful in that moment, that is still cultivating sattva. So let's start with tamas, and we'll go up to rajas and sattva in regards to our meditative experience. So what is our experience like when tamas is predominating? Well, when we meditate, we tend to be sleepy, or we tend to need to fight to stay awake. It's common to lose awareness and occasionally realize, oh wow, I've been daydreaming for the last 5 minutes. Oftentimes when tamas is dominant, we'll experience a trance, which is almost like a stupor. You lose track of time, there's no sense of present moment awareness, and things pass, and you might feel more refreshed at the end, but that's because you've just taken a nap. Tamas has come over you, sleep has come over you, and that has its own health benefits, but for clarifying awareness, it's not going to help out a whole lot. Usually when people practice meditation for tamasic reasons, they're meditating to avoid pain, to ignore or suppress painful memories, thoughts, feelings, or states of being. So that's a tamasic reason. And again, it's very common for people to have those experiences in meditation. Now, rajas. When rajas is dominating our meditation, there's usually a desire to do something else because we feel bored, or there's a restlessness. We don't feel like we can stay interested in the process. We tend to get irritated or agitated, and it's very difficult to hold focus during our practice. And for those who actually might be very good at focusing, and they're not restless, well, the other side of that can be an extreme fixation on achieving some result or spiritual experience, or wanting to display your spiritual practice to others. You want to dramatize that you are a meditator or that you are a yogi. Now, the sattvic reasons for meditation, or the sattvic experience of meditation. When you're having a sattvic experience in meditation, there is usually an alert yet relaxed aliveness in the practice. It's almost like when you've witnessed a beautiful sunset and you weren't thinking, you were just simply pristinely aware of the beauty of nature. You weren't falling asleep, it was just there, filling your awareness. There tends to be a sense of peace and presence without any kind of restlessness or unconscious reverie. You're just present. There can be a gentle enthusiasm and joy in the simple act of prayer, meditation, or contemplation. And usually a person has a sense of peaceful illumination which permeates the rest of their day, and there's no need to display or dramatize that to the world. And so as you can see, having a sattvic practice would probably be very enjoyable, and it is. And you can probably relate a lot to the rajasic or tamasic part of the practice. And if you want to have a more sattvic experience, what you need to do is start to change what you bring into your life, the thoughts you allow in, the people that you surround yourself with, the foods that you eat, and figure out what are sattvic influences. I mean, how many of you have been in a difficult relationship or have had really dramatic friends, and then maybe you moved across the country or you spent some time away and you realized, wow, I don't have a lot of this anxiety and depression that I did before. And you realize that being around anxious, fearful, depressed people tends to influence your own field in that way. Or maybe you've observed that when you eat salads and fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains, that you feel lighter, you're able to get up earlier, you're not as groggy, your meditation is more clear and pristine. And when you drink a 6-pack of soda, or you eat a lot of steaks, or you live off candy bars, that your practice does seem to be very tiresome. You just kind of want to go to sleep and take a nap. Maybe you're a super aggressive person. Maybe you have a career that requires a lot of energy in that way. Or you're one of those super athletes that isn't actually exercising to be as healthy as possible. You're exercising to overcome some kind of psychological complex of feeling small or overcoming fear and so on. Well, you notice that when you sit to meditate, you approach meditation in the same way. You're trying to force it. You're trying to push it too hard. You're not being intelligent about it. And if you're an athlete, you know that if you eat right, if you exercise regularly, if you don't push yourself too hard, well then in time, you're going to be a very fit person. Well, the same thing applies to our meditation practice. If you can just find a way to set aside time every day to meditate without overthinking it, just doing your best to be present and engaged with the process, within a few months, within a few years, you recognize that your inner landscape has changed. You might not be perfect yet. You might not be able to live in accord with the yamas and niyamas in an enlightened way like your spiritual role models, but you recognize that you're pretty close. You can do a good job. Very different. You're very different than you were when you got started. Well, that's one way to mitigate rajas within the meditation process. And in a way, that's like surrendered practice, which is sattvic, where you're doing what needs to be done. You're doing it consistently. You're not worried about results, and you're doing things that support the process. And then again, you realize in a few months, in a few years, that changes actually have occurred for you. Spiritual growth is something that is very real and very experienceable for you. So start to consider these things. And as I've mentioned, if you want to go into a deeper study of the Gunas, you can join the Kriya Yoga online Patreon community. As of July 2024, we'll be having our monthly classes focused on the Gunas. Or simply just continue to study the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and continue to practice the yamas and niyamas, not as a moral imperative or something that you must do because an authority told you so, but because the teachings within the Yoga Sutras and the yamas and niyamas and those practices, they naturally cultivate more clarity, more sattva within your life. And when there is more sattva within your life, you will have a deeper understanding of the spiritual literature that you read. You will have a very real, visceral understanding of what enlightened saints and sages talk about. You will start to touch states of consciousness and meditation which are enlivening and illuminating. And you'll begin to access what Mr. Davis would call the radiant field of spiritual awareness. So consider these gunas. Consider their qualities, contemplate them, think about them, aim to learn a little bit more about them, and pay attention to what you're cultivating in your own life. And remember that the presence of rajas and tamas, it's nothing to be ashamed of, it's nothing to make yourself feel bad about, but just try, or don't even try, just do it. Avoid letting rajas and tamas define you. All right. Well, I wish you all well, and it's my wish that this presentation just stimulates a more conscious approach to your life.